All right. Good afternoon. All righty. Um, yeah, we're just going to jump right in. Um, it's been a few weeks since we've had Bible study, so it's good to have everybody back. Glad that you're here. Glad for those of you who are joining us on YouTube. Glad that you're with us as well. We're back in the swing of things. We're going to dive right in because what we're going to be looking at for our Bible study in the next, I don't know, however many weeks it's going to take us, um, is the Gospel of Matthew. Um, this year in the lectionary, in the Lutheran Church, we follow the 3-year lectionary, right? And each of the years usually highlights one of what we call the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, or Luke. And so the year that we are in for the lectionary highlights Matthew, which means that we're going to essentially read through most of the book of Matthew in our gospel texts for this year. Um, and you're thinking, well, wait a minute, in the 3-year lectionary, you get Matthew, Mark, and Luke. When does John get his day in the sun? Well, John is interspersed throughout all 3 years. And so as we get into it, you're thinking, Pastor, you said this was the year of Matthew. Why are we getting so much John, right? Because it just gets put in throughout. But what's really important, what's really helpful for us is the way in which Matthew is structured, put together, what it highlights. And so what I want to do today is do an introduction to the Gospel of Matthew. There are a few basic, fundamental who, what, where, why kind of questions that we need to address. This is really helpful. And you're thinking, well, this sounds particularly not exciting, but it actually is. Because in order for us to understand anything, we've got to kind of wrap our heads and our hearts around what is fundamental about these books that we read. And in this particular case, what's fundamental about the Gospel of Matthew? And so I'm going to do one thing and then we'll start. And I'm going to close that door so that and then I'm going to do one other thing. It's not right now, but we're okay. But I wanted to do turn off the speakers out here. Okay. There was just a couple housekeeping things that I needed to do because I neglected to turn off the speakers to the fellowship hall, which, makes it harder for the folks doing in Genesis Hope to do their work. All right, so let's get right down to it. Who wrote it? We'll start there. Actually, we won't start there. We'll start with something even more fundamental. What's it all about, right? And that's really the important thing I want you to take away from this is that right up here, what I said is that it's a manual for ministry. Fundamentally, Matthew wants us to understand what we need to do as church, right? And that means what we need to understand about who Jesus is and what Jesus does or what Jesus did and what Jesus calls us to do. And so I want you to think about those 3 things. Who is Jesus? Because that's going to be fundamental for understanding Matthew's gospel. Who is Jesus? What does Jesus do? And those 3 questions, right? Who is Jesus? What does Jesus do? What does Jesus call us to do? And so this notion that Matthew is this manual for ministry, it means, and I want you to understand that Matthew is going to define that as broadly as possible. And so think of it as a manual for life. How are we to live in light of who Jesus is and what Jesus does? And those are the fundamental things. And so Matthew is going to lay out two basic things throughout the entire gospel, and it's the longest one, right? There's going to be the narrative sections. He's going to tell us about who Jesus is by looking at these stages of his life. And then, and we're going to talk about this in just a moment, and I'll give you the pattern. And then there are going to be 5 discourses or 5 big teachings of Jesus, right? And so it's going to be narrative and then a teaching, narrative and then a teaching. And all of these things help us to answer those 3 questions. And it's fundamental that we start with who is Jesus for Matthew. Matthew, if we don't get anything else out of the gospel, Matthew wants us to know who this guy is and to point out that he's not just a guy, right? That Jesus is Son of God, that Jesus is Messiah. From the very beginning in the Gospel of Matthew, we know that Jesus is something more than just another prophet, right? This is all just, it's the prologue, it's the prelude to understanding the whole gospel. Is if we understand who Jesus is, everything else follows, right? Because if we know who Jesus is, then we know what Jesus has done and we know what Jesus has called us to do. And so when we read through the gospel, we're reading through what we need to know and how we need to live. Just like that, right? And you think, well, that's simple, right? We should be able to dispense with this entire book, all 28 chapters in just a couple of weeks, right? There's so much going on, and it's so important to really grasp this. But I am always, first and foremost, not only a pastor, but a historian. And so I've got some questions that we need to answer. And the first is, great, who wrote it, right? Because we have to ask this of every single thing that we read. And that's true of what we read from the ancient world. It's true of what we read right now, right? You read anything on the internet, anything that shows up in social media, you should always ask yourself some fundamental questions. And the first one is, who wrote it? And this is really important, especially when you're thinking about like social media and all that kind of good stuff. The biggest problem we have right now is if you don't know who wrote it, you don't know why they wrote it. You don't know where it came from. You can't make sure that it was actually real, right? Especially nowadays, it could be a computer algorithm that just, coughed up something that, somebody put in a few words into a prompt and you got this idea. Where did it come from? Who wrote it? And so everything that you read, right? This is really important. You've got to ask yourself that question. So some basic questions about reading texts, and I mean reading books or reading articles or just reading, is you've got to ask yourself the first question, who wrote it? Right? Because that starts to situate things, and it's really important. A lot of people get in a lot of trouble because they post and repost things on social media without knowing where it came from, right? Or who it came from, right? And that little thing, that tiny little thing, is such an important component of how we talk to one another. If you don't know where it came from, you should be a little leery, and you should do a little bit of digging. Find out if you can. And so here's the question about this particular gospel It's called the Gospel according to Matthew. What Matthew? Exactly. Which one? Who wrote it? And here's the question. We don't know. We have clues. The first thing you're thinking, well, wait a minute, Pastor. It's a slam dunk. It literally says the Gospel according to Matthew, right? So does that not imply that it was Matthew, likely the disciple Matthew, the tax collector? It is the first thought, and it's a really good one, except for the fact that it wasn't given the title of Gospel according to Matthew until the 2nd century. Right. Likely is not. And the other thing that we know is that, and this is also going to be helpful, when was it written? If it was written by one of the disciples, it would have been written in around the 30s, right? Because Jesus dies in 33. So 30s or 40s would be the assumption. None of the Gospels are written that early. None of them. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. None of the Gospels are written that early. In fact, we don't get the first written stuff from anybody in the new church until Paul's letters. Paul's letters are starting to be written around 45 to 55. All right? And so I have a really important question to ask. And it's one that I've asked before. Why is it in the Gospels, the earliest Gospel that was written was probably Mark, and that was written in the 60s, right? Ish. Maybe the 70s. Why is it that it takes so long for the Gospels to be written down? A good number of them were illiterate, probably didn't read or write, but a number of them definitely did. If Matthew was a tax collector, which meant that he was both literate and numerate. He could read, he could write, and he could do math, right? Luke was a physician. He also was educated. And so we do have a good collection of folks who were literate and illiterate. Likely as not, Peter probably couldn't read or write. Not likely. He was a fisherman, for heaven's sakes. It's not like something that he needed to do. So literacy isn't right. But literacy may not be the issue. So the question then is, why didn't they write things down so early? Why did it take until later, do you think? Well, yeah, they were busy, but shockingly enough, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. We can both do the ministry and do some writing. It's the only way. It is, but it's not expense. I want you to think about something that's kind of important, and that's this. The original disciples didn't need to write anything down, did they? Because they had lived it. They had lived it. They had walked with Jesus. They had seen what he was doing. They heard his things. What would make you want to write something down? Do you think? Yeah. It was, yep, 100%. And here's the thing. You don't start writing things down until you need to write them down. This is not a culture in which everything is written down. We're so used to living in a culture where you write everything down, right? Um, there was probably, literacy rates were probably 20 to 30% back then. And not for any other reason than most people didn't need to be able to read or write. But you write things down because the original followers were starting to get old, or they were starting to die, or they were being persecuted. And so you write things down so that you preserve what's going on, what went on. You write something down so you don't forget, or that you can pass it on to the next generation, right? This is essentially the baton being passed from the original apostles to the next generations. They weren't there. You got to start writing things down. And so the Gospels emerge at this time because people wanted to remember. And this is a very important thing because Matthew's Gospel was probably written by somebody who was a disciple of Matthew the tax collector, right? Somebody in the church or the congregation that he originated, right? And that's what's really important. You ascribe things to the disciples because you're trying to say, oh, no, there's a direct connection, right? It's their bona fides, right? It's their good faith, understanding that this is somebody who actually was related to or surrounded by, folks who were there, right? And so it connects back to the original disciples. And so you say, this was written by the gospel is called the Gospel according to Matthew. Because it could be what Matthew told or the stories that surrounded in the congregation that formed. Yes, Sandra. Yeah. Yes, exactly. It was, and that really figures very importantly in this. The oral tradition, the stories we pass from one generation to the next. In a illiterate society, right? And again, that's not a value judgment, that's just a statement of fact. Not everybody could read or write. But in that kind of situation, the story you tell, that oral tradition, carries so much weight, right? But after a while, you want to really like, wait a minute, we don't want to lose these stories. We don't want to lose all of this detail, the richness, the importance of what it means for Jesus's teachings in our lives. We don't want to lose this. And so somebody says, you know what? Got to write this down. It's kind of like a friend of mine back when I was living in South Bend, Indiana. He's a professor of Africana Studies at the University of Notre Dame. And he would often go and take oral histories from people groups that he was studying. Well, and this was really important. He went and he would sit down and interview people and would take their histories. He would hear their stories because nobody had ever written them down. And if it doesn't get written down, it's going to get lost because somewhere along the line, people are going to stop telling the stories. Yeah. And so in cultures, in groups where the oral tradition is at its strongest, somebody's going to go, oh, wait a minute. Can you write that down? E- e- Exactly. Right, exactly. All of that. So, because Alex Haley then, as a historian, goes to the farthest back that he can go, and that's going to be descendants, and you're going to say, well, tell me the stories, right? Tell me what happened. That's something similar to what's going on here. You want to make sure you hold on to things. Now, this writer then, who we will call Matthew because it's easier, right? We do know a few things about. One of the things is that clearly a lot of these stories come from the oral tradition, but that's not his only source. He also probably reads the Gospel of Mark because the Gospel of Mark is the first gospel written down. And so other gospel writers will base themselves off of Mark's recollections and Mark's writings. Now, what's interesting is you can look at this. The Gospel of Mark is what, maybe 13 chapters, thereabouts? Matthew is 28. So clearly, yeah, it's twice as long, which means that he's building out the bare bones of Mark's structure and adds to it. He fills out the gaps. Mark's gospel is very quick and short, and it's short and punchy. It's trying to get, he's always in a rush. In this particular case, right, Matthew's got more to talk about, and that's in and of itself really important. The other thing that starts to really give us a sense of who Matthew is or who the writer is that Matthew quotes the Old Testament more than any of the other gospel writers. There's at least 60 direct quotes from Old Testament sources, which means that Matthew has an Old Testament. Or if not a rabbi, he had access. And what it starts to tell us something is something really important. And that's that we're going to talk about. The next question is, who is the audience? This is also something important for anything that's ever been written down. Anything, ever. The moment you write something down, you're writing it for an audience. It's to somebody, right? Even if it's a grocery list. That grocery list you're writing down, who is the audience for your grocery list? You are. Right, unless somebody else is going to do the shopping, right? But if you write down a grocery list, right? You write it down for you. That's the audience. But there is an audience, right? Why? So you don't forget, right? This is a good thing because I often do the day-to-day shopping. Denise does the big shopping, or actually we do that together. We have an app on our phone where we can make our grocery list. It's amazing because, no joke, I go home, once I'm done for the day here, I stop at the market or I walk up to the market. And if it's not written down, if I'm supposed to remember the 6 things that we're going to need, I'm going to remember 3 of them at best, right? And then I'll get home and Denise will say, oh, did you get this? I'm like, oh. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And so everything that is written down has an audience. I mean, even the receipts that you get printed, right? The audience for the receipt is the store and the customer, right? It's a proof of sale. And so that both parties can say, wait, this contract, which is what a receipt essentially fundamentally is there. And it's for both of us. So when you're reading even a book of the Bible, you have to ask yourself, great, who did he write it for? Who is this written for? Who's the audience? Who's receiving this? And in this case, this is the most important thing in understanding who Matthew is and why he's writing. He's writing because he wants to answer these questions about Jesus, right? But he's writing it for a very specific group. Matthew wasn't writing for everybody, right? He was writing for probably one congregation. They were Jewish, right? It was probably a group of Jewish Jesus followers, which is what they were called in the beginning. They were called Jesus followers. You didn't call them Christians for a little bit. But these Jewish Jesus followers, right? Probably in Antioch, Syria. That's their best guess. And likely as not, and this is going to be something that's really important because in Matthew, this comes out all the time. This is probably a group of Jewish believers in Jesus who got kicked out of their synagogue. Likely as not. Because you can see there's some real tension between the writer and Jewish authorities. And later, other Jews who did not believe, right? And so Matthew was writing for a very Jewish community. He himself was profoundly Jewish, and we can see that in all of the rites and rituals and ideas and the theology and the fact that anytime he needs to make a point, he's like, wait, the Old Testament said this, right? which means he's connected. This is a believer of great faith, but also a certain amount of frustration that not everybody believes, right? This is going to be a problem. And so he's not antagonistic with all Jews, which sometimes if you read it and you don't know about his community, you could say, man, Matthew's got a real problem with Jewish folks, right? Well, he's got a real problem with a very specific group that probably kicked his crew out of the synagogue, or they left, or something like that. And if you've ever been involved in a congregation that splits, right, is that usually a happy occasion? Usually it's a really cantankerous, fraught, little intense. Yeah, exactly. They tend not to say polite things about the other group, right? Splitters, or we kick them out, or unbelievers, or you name it, right? It gets really nasty really fast. Human beings are not great when it comes to that kind of tension, all right? So Matthew's got a group of folks who he's writing to who've either been pitched out or walked out. They have issues with those folks, right? The problem is this. The problem is that after that first generation, people lost sight of what that original tension was about, and they blew Matthew's ideas up into that all Jews are bad. All Jews are problematic. And that isn't true at all, right? It has not gone away. That has been, if the Christian church has an original sin, it's their anti-Judaism. Not anti-Semitism, but anti-Judaism. And there's a difference. Because Semitic really just means a whole family of language. It's a very indelicate term in many ways. Anybody from the Middle East who writes essentially from right to left, these are the Semitic languages. Well, that involves, well, Hebrew and Arabic and Aramaic and anything, so a lot of that. And so I say anti-Judaism because it's more theologically accurate, right? There's a problem that Christians are going to develop against Jewish people and Jewish belief. And I just want to tell you that that's not what's going on in the book of Matthew, right? Christians will take what happens in the book of Matthew and blow it up into this crisis, but it's not there. If there's antagonism, it's between a very select group of peoples, right? And it's because they couldn't come to terms over that question of who is Jesus, right? And we're not going to relitigate all that, right? Because in the Lutheran Church, we have taken the stance that the Jewish people are the people of the promise, and that's up to God, and God's not, that's not our concern. That's not our concern, right? How God works out the covenant with the Jewish people is up to God and the Jewish people, right? We don't proselytize. We don't try to convert Jewish people. They're people of the promise. We're people of the promise. It's just that our promises come through Christ. And so let's not wade into that, because Christians have done a lot of horrific damage over the last 2,000 years because of that one thing. And it ain't up to us, right? Our job is to get along with everybody, right? Because that's how Jesus called us to live. And so that's just one of those things, And so we ask these questions so we don't fall into those kind of pitfalls. Because it's really easy to just say, oh, look in Matthew, he's antagonistic with Jewish people, so should we. No, that's missing the point. Right, right. Yeah. And so I we have other fish to fry than worrying about that. We'll let God sort that out. And God's got a bigger sense of perspective than I do. And so I'm going to err on the side of grace. It's going to be easier. It's going to make our lives easier, and it's going to make everybody else's life easier if we err on the side of grace. Because you know what? Shockingly enough, God didn't give me a memo about all of this stuff. I don't know. And if I don't know, I'm not going to go wading in and saying, you know what? I think I know exactly what God's thinking. I'm going to get that wrong. Right? Yeah. I will go with what we have in Scripture, how we're inspired to live by the Holy Spirit, stirred to live by the Holy Spirit, and I will err on the side of grace. I maybe that's a little naive, but you know what? I think it's better than the alternative. Just one of those things that every now and then it's like, we've tried it the other way. Maybe let's try it this way. Just a thought. It's just an idea. All right. So, who wrote it? Who's the audience? When was it written? Hard to tell. Could have been, likely as not, after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, right? But it could be earlier. It could be much later. And you're thinking, boy, Pastor, you're just a fountain of, detailed information today. What I want you to do is I want you to think about this in the context of we're in the second or third generation of Christians. They're trying to find their way. And in this particular case, we're talking about a group of Jewish Christians or Jewish Jesus followers who have much more important concerns. And that is, who is this guy? What did he do? And how are we called to live? Right? If we do those things, sometimes I think we can get lost in the details when we have to remember Jesus is calling us how to live, right? And Matthew is saying, the best thing to do? Be a student of Jesus. Sit at the master's feet, listen to what he's teaching us, and then we'll go from there. Because if we actually listen to Jesus, then we wouldn't be making all the mistakes that we make, or at least not as many of them. All right. So, who wrote it? Who's the audience? When was it written? Why was it written? Why it was written is pretty simple. Matthew, or this author, wanted us to know. And he wanted to be able to give to his congregation a full telling, or as full of a telling as possible. And that kind of leads us then to what the structure looks like. So remember these questions, right? And then let me do a little bit more housekeeping on this. So there are two ways of thinking about the structure of the entire gospel. And I know this is not the most scintillating thing, but it's really important because as we read, right, you kind of need to know the context into which this is all working. So there's two ways of thinking about it. There's three basic sections that get broken down into different groups. The whole first part is the identity of Jesus. Those are that's chapter 1, verse 1 to chapter 4, verse 11. Matthew's going to come right out of the gate and he's going to tell us who Jesus is. The whole first chapter, which is not the most exciting reading, is a long genealogy. It's a long genealogy. It's just a whole list of names that this is why it's never read in church, because the poor reader that Sunday, it would be so hard. There was so many names, and we'd just be like, yeah. Why does Matthew put this genealogy first? Who does Matthew trace it back to? What's that? But most importantly, King David. He wants to immediately connect Jesus with the Davidic line of kings. And so what he's doing, almost just right from the beginning, Jesus is king. But Jesus is not just king of Israel, Jesus is the king of everything. Heaven and earth. Heaven and earth, right? From the very beginning, we get to understand that Jesus is no mere man. He's not a simple prophet, although very important. Jesus is Son of God and therefore King of heaven, right? From the very beginning, we're getting to know who Jesus is, and it's bigger than anything that anybody's talking. It's not even just King David, right? Because he's not just king of a group of people, even the people of God. Jesus is bigger and more universal than that. And so Matthew's swinging for the fences right from the get-go. All right, so the second part then is the message and the ministry. And that's from chapter 4, verse 12, all the way to 16, verse 20. We're going to get parables, Sermon on the Mount, the healing stories, the miracles, all this other kind of stuff. We're going to see so much of it in there, essentially giving us a sense. If this is a manual for ministry, right? And that's the phrase to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, so what is that ministry? Right? What's the message? What's the ministry? What does Jesus do? If the first part is who is Jesus, this is starting to dig into what does Jesus do, right? And it's really important, just fundamentally important that we start to get that sense. All right, the third one is the death and resurrection of Jesus. And this goes from 16:21 to 28:20 to the end of the book. What's really important in all of the Gospels is at the core of the story, what probably got written down first is this part. We call it the Passion narrative, right? But it's when Jesus starts on his way to Jerusalem, and then all the way through to the resurrection and the post-resurrection appearances. That's the heart of it, right? This is why this is not a biography. This doesn't give us all the details of Jesus' life because those aren't all important, right? It gives you the birth, very brief in Matthew. It gives you his ministry, which is 3 years long, and then it gives the last weeks of his life, and then his resurrection. Why? Because that's the heart of it all. That's what makes Jesus different than any other prophet, than any other person who's ever lived. All of this points to this, the death and resurrection. And the point of why that's so important is that Christ died for you and was raised for you so that you could live how you've been called to live. And that's just really important, right? This is the heart of it. And so in all the Gospels, what was probably written down first before they wrote everything else down was this part. Why? It's what makes Jesus different. This is Yes, yeah, exactly, Jackie. That in this we understand the magnitude of what Christ has done for us, right? And why he came to us in the first place, and what we are now called to do, and how we are called to live. It changes everything. All right? That's the linchpin on all of this. That's the key to the whole thing. Now, Matthew is then going to do this kind of an interesting way. So those three things, right? Identity, message and ministry, death and resurrection. And you're thinking, well, that's pretty much the basics. It is. The way Matthew unpacks that then is particularly important. I'm not going to go through all of this, but I just want to say that there's going to be times of narrative. So this is just, and then Jesus did this, and then Jesus did that, and then they went this place, and then it's the story, right? It's just the basic story. So you flip between narratives and then discourses, right? Discourse is a fancy way of saying teachings, right? So, I mean, this is just, so it's going to move from one to the other. And what's interesting is that of the discourses, there are 5 of them. 5 big dollops of Jesus teaching. And so one of the things that you're going to recognize is that what is one of the names that they called Jesus? What is one of the names that the disciples called Jesus throughout the gospel? Rabbi. And rabbi means teacher, right? Jesus as teacher, right? Somebody is going to stand up in front of the masses and tell them, okay, this is who I am, this is what I'm doing, but this is how you are to live, right? Jesus' fundamental role as rabbi, and again, this connects Matthew to the Jewish community, doesn't it? I mean, he's coming right out and telling you that Jesus is a rabbi. If Jesus is a rabbi, you know what he probably was? A Pharisee. Probably. He probably was. Who does Jesus argue with most? Pharisees. Sadducees, but usually the Pharisees. Pharisees are usually the one that he just gotta, And you know why? Because they should know better. You fight with the people that you're closest to. It's like you fight with your siblings more than you fight with anybody else, right? He's like, you should know better. They likely as not, because if you look at the difference between Sadducees, Pharisees, and say the Zealots or something like that, Jesus' beliefs, his outlook on Rome, all that other kind of stuff fits very nicely with the Pharisees, right? They're not bad guys, but they are the ones that they're like Jesus' classmates, and it grinds his gears that they just don't get it. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And so, is this, the professional clergy looking at a layperson saying, what do you know? Kind of thing. It may very well. Or it may be that Jesus was one of their classmates who went off and had these radical ideas, and they're just sitting going, oh man, I knew you when you were growing up, and you weren't like this back then. Yes, he was. And so, but yeah, it could be very well that. But Jesus, the way he looks at the world, the way he discusses Rome or anything, or the resurrection, right? These are all things that the Pharisees, who were the rabbis, which meant they were educated, they could read and write. Clearly, Jesus can read and write, right? Because he's always reading the texts, right? If he rolls out the scrolls, and when he was 13, and he could read from Isaiah, yeah, he's been educated. If he's been educated, he's likely in that Pharisaical group.
Wasn't his mother and his forefathers in the lineage of education?
Yes. Yeah.
Elizabeth's husband was a Pharisee.
Yes. Yeah. So he's got Pharisees in his family. In his earthly family, he's got Pharisees. He was likely raised in that because, like I said, the fact that we don't have a lot of information about him growing up, but the little bit of information, the fact that he's, when he's, busting his mom and dad's chops over the fact, when they got lost when he was young. And he's like, where did you think I was going to be? Right? Reading and discussing with the elders the scriptures. Okay, educated, right? And the educated group with those similar beliefs were the Pharisees. It's one of those things to think about. Which means that if you call him a rabbi, right, getting back to that, yeah, that's probably the best title for him. And it's why he also probably had followers, right? Because the popular or the big name or the thought-provoking rabbis of the time did too, right? They had schools of thought that kind of followed along with them. And so Jesus then becomes a very natural component of Jewish life in the first century with some unique perspectives, right? To be honest. All right, so in the 5 discourses, and I want to run through these real quick because the first one is the Sermon on the Mount. And if you think that I go long, that's, 5, 6, it's 3 chapters long. It goes on for a while, right? And so Sermon on the Mount is the first one. Think of that. That's his inaugural sermon. That's his inaugural teaching. And so the first time somebody says, I need you to pay attention to these things, then we really better pay attention, right? Then there's all sorts of stuff going on. I mean, the Sermon on the Mount may be the most dangerous thing that Jesus does because it sets the stage for everything else. If you want to understand who Matthew sees Jesus to be, read the Sermon on the Mount, right? The Sermon on the Mount, the one that a lot of Christians today would say is too woke, right? Right? It's too radical. It's too, all these other kinds of things. I love when the really conservative Christians go after their pastor. What is that nonsense that you've been preaching today? And he said, well, it's the Sermon on the Mount. Jesus wrote this. I didn't write this. This is not up to me. Blessed are the poor and blessed are the peacemakers and all that kind of stuff. That's just like, whoa, that's just crazy talk. No, right there. First thing that Jesus teaches. If it's the first thing, then you should really pay attention because it means it's that important. Right? Always pay attention to first and last things, right? Because you swing for the fences on the first try because you're trying to let people know what they really got to know. All right. Second discourse is the Manual for Missionaries. Okay, this is also important because it means that Jesus doesn't want you just to, oh, that's a nice teaching, Jesus. I'm going to hold it to my heart. And it's not going to go any further. No, 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 no. The whole business of what Jesus is teaching is that you take it with you into the rest of your life. And you spread it. You give it to other people, right? That's the interesting thing. So Jesus teaches, and then the next big discourse is, now go do the same thing. I'm going to send you out 2 by 2, and you're going to go do this, right? You're going to go spread the word. This is one of those things that modern day Christians in certain denominations are really bad at, and that is evangelism. To be God's messengers of love, of God's love to other people. Our job, right? Every Christian's job is to be a missionary, which means spreading the good news. That's what we're supposed to do, right? A lot of churches are not growing today, and they haven't been growing for decades because so many Christians are like, oh, that's very nice. It's so, and then they do nothing else with it, right? It stays in their head or in their heart or in their soul, and that's very nice. But you weren't called to keep it to yourself. You were called to share it. So there's the manual, right? What does this look like? There you go. It's like, have you ever been into a church? And this is one of those things that just drives me a little batty. Have you ever been in a church and there's a door or the sign at the door that says, now entering the mission field? Do you know why I might find that problematic? It implies that the mission field ain't the church itself, as if everybody in the church no longer needs to hear the good news. I think we all need to hear the good news. I think we all need to be reminded of the good news all the time, right? If you're thinking, well, now I'm going to go missionize out there to the poor unwashed. What about us? What about me even, right? What about the day that I come to church and I've got doubts? Do I not need to still hear the good news preached to me? I do. I mean, so that sign is always, I've been to a lot, and it's a lot of, mainline denominations that have churches like that. There's any number of the ELCA Lutheran churches in the synod that have that in there. And I always want to go to their pastor and go, really? Is that what you, really? I decided I should be a polite person, and I don't usually raise that because, I'm guessing that the number of churches that I would never be welcomed back to would be probably pretty significant, which is probably true anyway, but that's the way it is. All right, so manual for there's no inside or outside the mission field. It's all the mission field because everybody needs to hear the good news that Christ loves them and that Christ died and was raised for them. Why? So that we could finally live the life that we were created to live. If there's somebody alive that doesn't need to hear that message, I'd like to meet them. Right? Just one of those things. All right. The third discourse are the parables. Right? And we're going to get to this in just a second, all of this is going to be about the kingdom of heaven is like. The kingdom of heaven is like. Matthew, among all of the gospel writers, talks about the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven more than anybody else. Now, I'll get to why that's important. We'll kind of stick that, as our landing. All right. The fourth discourse. I'm going to have to erase these. Did everybody got this? Okay, cool. Number 4 is living together as the church. We're always in the business of inviting in, and that means we should always be in the business of growing, which means that we have always got to have the business of how do we live together, right? Because that's really important. Jesus knows that it's great that we're here, but Jesus also knows that we're human beings, and we're going to have a little difficulty sometimes living together, and so how do we do that? I think that's really practical, right? That's, Christians aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination, right? We need to figure out how to do this. But if we can teach each other, we can teach others, right? And that's the point. All right. So in between all of these discourses, and then the last one, you get these, so you get narrative, discourse, and it just kind of goes throughout the whole thing. The last one is Jesus teaches about the future judgment. How does this all wrap up? What happens? Right? And that's toward the end. This is, that's chapters 24 and 25. So this is getting to the end. Right? These are the teachings interspersed through this narrative conversation. And I want to spend just the last couple minutes today talking about the thing that is so unique to Matthew, and that is the kingdom. right? Matthew references the kingdom of heaven, especially, and it's an odd phrase. It is rarely used anywhere else in all of Scripture. In fact, Matthew uses that phrase itself, either kingdom of heaven or kingdom of God, at least 55 times throughout his gospel. 55 times. If you use a phrase over and over and over and over and over again, it's important. You're trying to get it's why ad campaigns know that they have to show. I've always asked this question. How many times do you need to see an advertisement before you remember what's in it? Do you think? It's more than that. How many times do you have to see an ad or hear an ad on the radio before it actually sinks in? 17 times. Marketing folks have done the homework on us. They've done the research. It takes 17 times before you finally go, oh, when you hear it and then you make the connection with what they're actually selling. Right? There's any number of ads I've seen so many times I couldn't tell you what they're selling if you paid me. But if you see it over and over and over, why? To get it into your head. Matthew keeps referencing the kingdom of heaven. The 55 times it's used in Matthew is more than the rest of the New Testament combined. Right? He talks about the kingdom of heaven when he's talking about John the Baptist, when he's talking about the beginning of Jesus' ministry, when he sends out the disciples, right? Preach that the kingdom of heaven is near. The Beatitudes, the parables, the kingdom of heaven is like. Even the Lord's Prayer, right? On earth as it is in heaven. He uses the phrase so regularly. And it's not because he's afraid to use the word God. He uses the word God all the time, right? That's not, people have posited this theory that he was just trying to not say God's holy name. He does it all the time. This is not at least 50 times he uses the word for God. Matthew pairs heaven and earth because he wants to differentiate heaven and earth. There's a contrast between the two realms, right? There's a difference in the way that God does things and the way that we've been doing things. And that what Jesus is bringing us by bringing heaven to earth in himself, right? He's the king, right? Is that God wants us to know how to live. And we live on earth as it is in heaven, right? Jesus is God's inbreaking, or the inbreaking of God's kingdom into our lives, right? Because he's going to say, look at the other kingdoms of the world. He's going to look at Rome and all the other historical ones, Babylon and Persia and you name it, Assyria, go throughout all the history. Look at all these kings, even look at King David, right? They all fall short. They all fail. They all falter. They all start to think more about themselves than about the people, right? And so Matthew is going to keep kind of hitting us over the head with the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of heaven, because he wants us to understand that this is how we can live now. Yeah, we're finite. We're going to make mistakes. We're not going to get it right. But you know what? Let's aim. We've got a direction to go in. Right? The Beatitudes give us an image of the blessed ones that is just the opposite of the way the world would naturally value, right? The poor in spirit, the persecuted, the mourning, the meek, the peacemakers, right? That's not the way kingdoms have been run. And Jesus saying, right, that's the whole point. Because you keep trying to do the whole kingdom of power and might and violence and all the rest, and it doesn't work. The parables of the kingdom paint us pictures where debtors are freely forgiven. The smallest seed produces the largest tree. The last workers receive the same reward as the first. That God's sense of economy and justice is just completely different from ours, to which we should say hallelujah. Thank God for that. Because our sense of justice, our sense of economy is always, well, bad for the vast majority of the people. Why do we keep doing the things that hurt the most people? That's what this is all about. So Matthew's going to keep making this contrast between the kingdom of heaven, where God does things differently, and us, and we keep doing the same old things and then wondering why things don't get better. And there comes Jesus saying, you know what? You can do better. You can live better. You could have it so much better, right? King of the universe, he enters Jerusalem not on a war horse or a golden chariot, but riding on a donkey. And as king, he's willing to go to the cross as his throne to show that the way the world works is broken and there's a better way, right? Matthew is contrasting the kingdom of heaven with the power of the kingdoms of earth. And the kingdoms of earth always look really bad in comparison. Why do we keep choosing them? Interestingly enough, the book that is most similar to what Matthew is doing isn't one of the Gospels. It's the book of Daniel, right? Daniel's always telling us that the kingdoms of earth are going to fall, they're going to falter, they're going to fade, and that the kingdom of God is what we should be looking for, hoping for, yearning for. And here's Jesus come to give it to us and to show us how to do it and to show us how to live differently. I want you to, we'll end with this. I want you to think the final scene in the Gospel of Matthew is Jesus is surrounded by the 12 disciples. And he says to them, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. That's the last word. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations. For Matthew, to be a Christian is to be a student of Jesus. And then to take what you have learned and share it. How does the world get better? How are we healed? By listening to the King of Heaven and his radically different way. And then going off and living that and sharing that with everybody we meet to the ends of the earth, all nations. It's inclusive. There's not a bit of exclusivity in this. This is the Gospel of Matthew, right? And I'm really looking forward to starting to dig into it. So what we're going to do is for next Wednesday, I want you to read the first 4 chapters of Matthew. We're going to do the whole who is Jesus bit. We're going to look at Jesus' identity, and so we're going to start with that. So, first 4 chapters of the book of Matthew. Thank you to those of you who have been joining us online. And something to remember for those of you who are joining us on YouTube, either live or you're going to catch it later, you can always put questions into the chat. Right? And even if I don't see them in the midst of the class, I'm going to go back, right? And I'll answer anything that you've got. Likewise, as you have questions, just stop me and say, wait, Pastor, zip it. Listen, answer my question. Because that's why I want to do this. But thank you for your patience today. There's a lot to go through, a lot to think about, a lot to pray about. Right? And what Matthew would encourage you to do is to take it all seriously, right? There's something big here, the biggest thing maybe ever, right? That Matthew wants us to understand. And that's why he wrote this down. He wrote it down for his congregation, but it applies to us, right? Who is Jesus? What did Jesus do? What does Jesus call us to do? We focus on those things. Well, on earth as it is in heaven. That's not a bad way to start the new year. Yeah? All right. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you for church Sunday at 10 o'clock, and then we'll be right back here next Wednesday at 12:15. Thanks, everybody.